Welcome back, guys. On today's video we're going to be changing the 3 external drive belts, so that's your power steering, your alternator and your water pump and your AC belt on this 2010 Hyundai Getz with the 1.4 litre petrol engine in it. This will also apply to the 2006 to 2011 models, so stay tuned and we'll show you how to get this job done. There's a few different tools and parts you're going to need to do the job. We've opted for genuine belts from Hyundai, with the part numbers listed here and in the description below. Then we've got some socket wrenches with a 10, 12 and 21mm socket, as well as an extension. And we've grabbed some 12mm spanners that are going to help us to get to some of the trickier bolts. We've got a torque wrench and a crowbar. You can substitute that for a different pry bar that you might have at home. For safety, we've got some glasses and some gloves, and we've also got a torch to help us see a bit better. Then finally, we have a jack and a jack stand. So to get to these drive belts, we actually have to take the driver's side wheel off. So we're just going to jack the car up and we'll show you where we put the jacking point. Under here, you can see 2 little divots. So we're going to line up the scissor jack in between those and then start to raise the car. Just make sure that before you start to raise the car, you chocked both of the back wheels. So the idea here is just to get the vehicle high enough to slide the jack stand underneath the chassis rail. You can then lower the car onto the jack stand. We can then take our 21mm socket and start to remove the wheel nuts. Then you can slide your wheel off and put it over to the side. Now if that comes off like that, don't worry, because that can go on easily once we're finished with the job. Once the wheel's off, we'll need to remove this black cover that's held on by 4 10mm bolts. There's 3 on this side and then 1 at the front here. So just put that cover over to the side together with the 4 bolts. You can see that it's exposed the belts here. Now there is a tensioning bolt that we will start to loosen while we're down here, but we'll show you that from a different angle. We've repositioned the camera to look in from where the right wheel was, and we're going to be undoing this bolt here with a 12mm socket or a 12mm spanner, and it's behind this pulley here, which is the tensioning pulley for this belt. Now loosening this bolt will relieve the tension on the belt. Tightening it will do the opposite. Once the belt's nice and loose and you feel like it's going to be able to slip past that tensioning pulley, we'll head up to the top and loosen the other belts. So looking from the top of the engine now, and you can see that the 3 belts are on the same side as the wheel that we removed. We're going to start by loosening the power steering belt, which is done by loosening the bolt in here on a slotted hole, as well as this bolt here, which allows the entire power steering pump to rock in this fashion. You want to be using either a 12mm socket or a 12mm spanner for all of these bolts that we're going to do from the top. And then you can see that with those 2 bolts loose, the power steering pump is free to move, and that's going to allow you to detension the belt and remove it. So just leave that loose for now and we'll move on to the alternator, which is further below. So the alternator is directly below the power steering pump, which we were just rocking. The tightening bolt is here and the lock bolt is here. You want to loosen this one first and then loosen this until the entire alternator can rock back and forth in a similar way to the power steering pump. That's going to allow you to loosen the belt and take it off. Once you've loosened the tensioning bolt and the lock bolt, try and rock the alternator back and forth, and if you're finding that it's still tight, you may need to loosen the bolt underneath the alternator, which is the one that the alternator actually pivots on, and we'll show you where that is. So this is the bolt that the alternator pivots on. It's a 12mm and you want to loosen it slightly and see if the alternator moves back and forth. Once that's loose, apply some upward pressure on the alternator, and if you can feel it rocking, we're ready to start to take the belts off. So the first belt you want to remove is the alternator belt, which is this front one. So just slide it up and around the pulleys. Then we can remove the air conditioning belt by sliding it towards us off the tensioning pulley. If you're struggling to get this belt off, you can rotate compressor pulley from the top of the engine bay. And then lastly, to get the power steering belt off, just apply a bit of pressure on the power steering pump and push it towards the engine. And that should give us enough slack to lift the belt off the pulley. Once it's off this top pulley, let it fall down below and you can grab it off the last pulley. It can be a good idea to keep your old belts in the car as spares, just for worst case scenarios. Now we're going to start installing the new ones in the reverse order that we removed these. So starting with your power steering belt. So same as before, just apply a bit of pressure onto the power steering pump towards the engine. Now before you move on to the next belt, just check that it's moving nice and freely and it's in the correct grooves. So for this one you want to reach up through this gap and wrap it around the air conditioning pulley to the top left. And then with both hands, just reach around to all the pulleys and make sure that it's spinning freely and in the correct position on the pulleys. And then finally, we can put on our alternator and water pump belt, which goes around the crankshaft pulley here, the water pump pulley up here, and the alternator pulley here. Again, you may need to move your alternator back and forth to get enough slack to be able to put the belt on. So with your hands, just pull the belt around the pulleys to make sure that it's sitting in the ribs properly. Now that the new belts are on, we can start to tension them up. So the factory service manual uses a method which deflects the belt with a known force and then measures that deflection to work out the tension. The tools to do that are quite tricky to get into this small space. However, we will provide the values in case you want to do it that way. In our case, we're going to do the twist method, which is approximate, but it works reasonably well in this case. It's important to note that over-tensioning or under-tensioning the belt can lead to reduced belt life, or over-tensioning it can reduce the bearing life of these other rotating components. So take your 12mm spanner and tighten this bolt here to tension your aircon belt. So as you tighten this bolt, you want to be checking the tension on the belt with your preferred method. Once you hit your desired value, you can move on to tensioning the other belts. To access this belt by hand, we found that the easiest spot was from the top of the engine bay. So if you slide your hand down on the side of the engine, you should be able to just touch that belt. And it is a bit tight and fiddly, but I can just about twist that belt a half turn. So I'm happy with that tension, and I'm going to move on to the other belts. Now we can tension the alternator belt, which is done using this bolt here. So tightening this bolt pushes the alternator away from the car and applies tension on the belt. You're going to have to tighten this and then check the tension and maybe do it a few times. Once you're happy with the correct tension, you can come back here and lock it off with this bolt, and they're both using 12mm sockets. Now the easiest place to check the tension on this belt is from back underneath where the wheel was removed. I'm happy with how much I've tensioned it, so now I'm going to tighten it using this lock bolt. Now don't forget that earlier we loosened the bolt underneath the alternator to allow it to pivot, so we're going to get under the car and make sure that other bolt is tight. We couldn't find torque specs for these, so we're just going to snug them all up. So again, that bolt that the alternator pivots on is this one here, just above the oil filter. So we want to tighten this one up as well. Then we can get on to tensioning the last belt, which is the power steering belt. So to tension the power steering belt, you're going to need a 12mm open-ended spanner and some kind of pry bar. This bolt in here is on a slotted hole, which will move with the power steering pump. And then this is the pivot bolt down here. So what we're going to do is insert our pry bar in the gap between the engine and the power steering pump. And we're going to apply a bit of force just to leverage the power steering pump away from the car. While you're applying a bit of pressure to the power steering pump, just check the belt tension on the left, and if you're happy with the tension, lock it off with this bolt. We found that it wasn't really practical to get a torque wrench onto this bolt, so we're just going to snug it down. Once you've locked this off, just check the tension again, and if you're happy with it, come back here and tighten this pivoting bolt. Now that we've got all the belts on and they're tensioned, we're going to run the car for about 5 minutes, then turn it off and recheck the tension. Once you've run the car and retensioned the belts as required, we're going to put that cover on with these 4 bolts. Remember that these take a 10mm socket. Once they're all in finger tight, we're just going to go around and snug them up. Then let's get that right hand wheel on. So lift the wheel up and put it onto the studs. Then if your cover came off like ours did, put that back on. And then you can start threading these in. So grab your 21mm socket and we're just going to snug these up, and then once the car's on the ground, we'll tighten them properly. Now we can start removing the jacks. The correct torque spec for these wheel nuts is between 65 to 80 foot-pounds, so we picked a value of about 75 foot-pounds, which is about 100 Newton meters. As always with wheel nuts, you want to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. That's it guys, that's all there is to changing the drive belts on this 2010 Hyundai Getz. If there's anything you want to see in a future video or any feedback you have for us, it's always welcome, so let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.